All right, looks like we're settling off on the participants, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you're coming from the ISTA forum, TempPak or TransPak, we are the final piece of that puzzle, the final caboose of the whole virtual conference week. So thank you for hanging in there to the very end. If you're from an outside source other than the ISTA conference, we'd like to welcome you as well. We'd like to take a moment and thank the ISTA staff, Lisa and Kathy and AJ and Eric, for putting on such a great conference the past week. It's always the highlight of the year to be in the ISTA community and to share stories and knowledge with everybody there. Hopefully next year we'll all be together again. My name is Nora Cravello. I am the president and CEO of WESTPAK. WESTPAK is an independent testing laboratory based in California, although we have customers all over the country and all over the world, in fact. I was thinking this past week about some of the products that have been on our Vibe machines. We've had an electric motorcycle, a pallet of almond butter, a lot of pharmaceutical devices, medical devices, and a lot of pharmaceuticals. We've had consumer packaged goods all over the place. And that's representative of you, our audience today. You come from telecom, medical device, pharmaceutical, all sorts of different industries. And what's interesting about that is that the distribution environment, the vibration, the drops, the compression, it's the great equalizer. All products need to get to their end market, to their end user by going through the distribution environment. And that's what WESTPAK focuses on. Now, because you're from different industries, you have different regulations, different regulatory bodies, and therefore different requirements to get your testing completed. Today, we're really going to be speaking to the medical device and pharmaceutical market, those that follow the MDR and ISO 11607 standards. That's really going to be the focus today. If you have questions outside of those industries, we're happy to follow up with you offline and see if we can answer any of those questions. To that point, Andrew Thomas is our speaker today. He is one of our lab managers down in San Diego. He's been with WESTPAK about 10 years. He's very keen intellect, contagious smile. I'm just so grateful that he's part of our team because he brings so much. He always says, yes, it's great for our customers. And he is going to be speaking today on test method validation. It's not the sexiest of topics. It's not the most exhilarating of topics, but we're going to try our best to deliver answers to some of the questions that you have. So with that, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction, Nora. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Thomas, and I'm excited you're all here to talk about test method validation. Like Nora said, it's not the most exciting topic, but it has been getting a lot of buzz lately. So hopefully this presentation serves as a good intro to what it actually is and helps some people out. So with that, let's begin. The aim of this presentation will be to touch on the process of test method validation with the focus on medical device package testing. The push for validated testing has recently come from regulatory bodies in the United States and Europe. Specifically, there have been revised regulations in Europe that are tasked with improving medical patient safety. The aim of these revised regulations is to reduce infection risk due to microbial contamination of medical devices. In the next 15 minutes or so, we'll discuss general terminology, touch on the regulatory requirements for method validation, discuss test method validation, or TMV for short. Then we'll go into examples of specific test methods, as well as walk through a few TMVs performed at WESTPAK. Before we dive into the regulations, I think it would be beneficial to briefly discuss what TMV, or test method validation, actually is. In one sentence, TMV can be described as the process of ensuring a test method is suitable for its intended use. This process involves establishing a method's performance characteristics and limitations by identifying influences that might change those characteristics. This is accomplished by evaluating the test method and is confirmed by testing. By going through this process, a TMV will provide an assurance that the test results will be accurate, reliable, and fit for the intended purpose. Performing validations on equipment and tests is not something new. However, the requirements for them to be performed on test methods has seen a recent push by several regulatory bodies. So let's dive into everyone's favorite type of bedtime reading, government regulations. In the United States, the FDA, with the backing of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR for short, include requirements for process validation. Specifically, in the CFR Title 21, Section 820 defines what process validation is. The FDA also recognizes consensus standards ISO 11607, Parts 1 and 2, titled Packaging for Terminally Sterilized Medical Devices. Part 1 covers the requirements for materials, sterile barrier systems, and package systems. Part 1 of the standard is the main focus of this presentation. Part 2 addresses the validation requirements for forming, sealing, and assembly processes from a manufacturer viewpoint. Let's take a look at what these regulations look like directly from the CFR. I won't get into details for this giant wall of text, but in section 820, you can find a few of the requirements for process validation. Notice how many times the word validated or some form of the word validate appears. Each of these bullet points addresses different aspects of validation that must be met in order to meet the regulations. In Europe, the requirements for validation are driven by the European Union's Medical Device Regulation, or MDR. The MDR was approved by the EU back in April 2017. Its objectives include improving medical device quality, reliability, and safety. The MDR was originally planned to go live back in May of 2020. However, like many things in life, the pandemic forced a one-year delay. The MDR is currently set to go live on May of this year and will replace the EU's current Medical Device Directive, or MDD. In Annex 1, Chapter 2 of the MDR, it states that devices labeled as sterile shall be processed, manufactured, packaged, and sterilized by means of appropriate validated methods. Requirements for validation, validated test methods, and validated testing are all key terms used in the MDR. It's funny, you'll notice that although this requirement may be just one small sentence, notice again how the word validated is key to understanding the requirement and scope of work that must be accomplished to show that these requirements are met. Switching over to ISO 11607, you'll see similar statements and requirements. Let's briefly discuss ISO 11607, Part 1, and the latest 2019 revision. I'm told that the writers of 11607 are doing their best to comply with the MDR's requirements. As MDR changes, ISO 11607 will follow, so you can expect new revisions to be forthcoming as these changes are made. The specific section that calls out the requirement for test method validation is section 4.4. This section details some of the parameters and justifications required by TMV. This section states that a rationale or justification must be made and documented while selecting test methods. It also calls out the requirement to establish and provide reasoning for determining the acceptance criteria of these test methods. Lastly, you'll notice our favorite word validated being used once again. In this instance, the requirement for validated testing falls to the laboratory, and is pretty much the reason why I'm talking to you today. Section 4.4 and its subsections can be used as the basis for performing TMVs. Let's take a look at subsection 4.4.4 and dive deeper into the actual requirements of what a TMV shall provide. This section defines more clearly the specific requirements a TMV must be able to prove. The three key items that a validated test method must prove are that it must have a determination of test method repeatability, a determination of test method reproducibility, and an establishment of test method sensitivity for integrity tests, which can be considered the precision and bias. Section 9 of 11607 defines the requirements for package system validation. You'll notice that if the sterile barrier being tested first conforms with the validation requirements per ISO 11607 Part 2 for forming, sealing, and assembly processes, and meets the requirements for performance and stability testing, the package shall be considered validated. A key point to understand is that a package validation is a combination of a full suite of test methods. Each of these test methods must be individually validated. Section 9.3 addresses any changes that can affect the status of a validated package system. The key takeaway from this section is that these examples, if they occur, may require a validated package system to go through revalidation. Alright, hopefully you're still with me. I promise these are the last few slides on regulations. Annex B of 11607 contains a list of standardized test methods, guides, and procedures that can be used to demonstrate conformity. This section of the standard is multiple pages long and contains a wide range of test methods. As a third-party lab for medical devices, some of the more common test methods performed and requested by our clients are included in this and the following slide. The tests in the table below are ISTA performance tests that are called out in Annex B. If you're familiar with these standards, you'll note that most of them include several additional test methods within them that must also be validated. The tests listed on the tables below are a combination of distribution, also known as shipping simulation tests, as well as sterile barrier tests. Several of these methods are included in the ISTA standards we referenced in the previous slide. We'll get into the details of these in a bit later. I know regulations are not the most exciting thing to discuss, but it's important to have a background as to why processes and test methods must be validated. The goal and purpose of these regulations always comes down to patient safety. Alright, and now for what I think is the fun part. So we've touched on the requirements, but how is this actually done and what does a TMV look like? Since we work with so many clients that must meet these regulatory requirements for validated tests, the requirements for the test themselves in a way gets passed to us and is then verified by our clients. There are many ways to complete a TMV, and the approach we took is here. First, we delve into the requirements and regulations as we discussed in the previous slides. The next two steps, evaluation and defining the TMV parameters, are essential to completing a validation. The bulk and the effort and time will be spent during these first three steps, and if done properly, it will make the remaining steps much, much easier. Let's dive into evaluation. During this step, we looked at all of our test offerings and determined which methods required validation for customers that are subjected to regulatory requirements. From a manufacturer perspective, they would need to determine which tests are required to perform a whole package system validation. This may or may not include all of the tests we at WESTPAK have validated. The key here is to determine what is appropriate for your intended purpose. For example, the requirements for a device that is sterile versus non-sterile will require a different set of tests for validation. Once the method and intended purposes are identified, we then went into defining the test method parameters. The parameters set the framework for the execution of the TMV and address the intended purpose of the test method. A key factor in determining the parameters is defining the acceptance criteria and what a pass or fail result will be. Now I want to touch on the different characteristics of an acceptance criteria for test method validation compared to the acceptance criteria of a package system validation because their purpose is very different. The acceptance criteria for test method validations will be dependent on if the test method is qualitative or quantitative. For qualitative tests like gross leak testing, the data that is generated will be an observation based on defined characteristics like a breach in the sterile barrier. The acceptance criteria for quantitative tests, like seal strength testing on the other hand, will produce a data set that must fall within a defined range. If the operator is able to identify known defects for a qualitative test or produce a data set that falls within the acceptance criteria for quantitative tests, this will then provide evidence that the test method is repeatable and reproducible. There's a major difference for the acceptance criteria of the package system validation. The purpose of a package system validation is to show that your production methods produce safe and reliable products with adequate packaging that will arrive safely and remain functional after transit. The acceptance criteria for a package system validation typically will require as little defects as possible based on an acceptable quality limit. Defects, however, do occur fairly often during this process. From our experience, it's not uncommon to see a package system go through multiple validation attempts. By clearly defining the parameters and completing test method validations, when these defects do occur, you can gain more confidence in the test results due to the level of evaluation that went into the test method validations. You will also be able to be more confident that the retest of a failed validation will go through the same exact process and test sequence. After the groundwork is laid by completing the first three steps, the remaining steps are relatively straightforward. After all of our parameters are defined, we create a plan for validation. This step involves creating any work instructions to align the consensus standards with your equipment. It also involves ordering any supplies and preparing the samples for the test trials. Now at this point we have several pieces of documentation that we will need to ensure that the person performing the test, the operator, is trained and capable in. This will ensure the TMV is performed and the data is recorded in the manner that we plan for. The execution is simply performing the test according to the plan we defined in the previous steps. After the data is generated, we review the results to ensure that they are what we expected. For example, for qualitative tests, This will involve ensuring that the defects were found and that no false defects were recorded. All of this is then wrapped together in a final test report. And that's it. I hope this sheds some light on the process for completing TMVs. Let's move on to discussing a few different test methods. There are many test methods that may be involved in a medical device package validation, which can be categorized into two groups. The first is distribution testing, which many people refer to as shake, rattle, and roll testing. Distribution testing will simulate hazards seen in the shipping environment. This can be considered the time a package system travels from the manufacturer to the end user or patient. The type of hazards seen during this process are inputs like drop, vibration from vehicles, as well as compression due to stacking. ISTA 3A and Astm D8282 are good representations of the standards used to simulate distribution. The second group of test types are sterile barrier tests. The majority of medical devices are sterilized prior to use in order to prevent patient infection. Sterile barrier testing will ensure that the sterile barrier remains intact and the devices are able to be used without risk of infection. These tests may include gross leak testing, seal strength testing, as well as visual inspections. Let's briefly walk through gross leak detection testing and what a TMV looks like. Consensus standard ASTM F2096 details gross leak testing. It is a sterile barrier test that involves submerging a sample beneath the water, pressurizing it, and looking for any breaches that would compromise the sterile barrier. To complete the TMV for this, we define the parameters and the acceptance criteria. We then ensure that the work instructions met the intended purpose and requirements of the test standard. The work instructions were also reviewed to ensure that detailed step-by-step instructions were included for WESTPAK's in-house equipment. After the operator's training was verified, they followed these instructions by conducting multiple trials that included a variety of failure types required to be identified. Upon review, the data that was generated showed evidence that the method provided repeatable and reliable test results. This showed that the test method was capable of identifying defects while meeting the acceptance criteria of the TMV and the standard. Once the execution and review is complete, you may ask yourself, what does a final TMV actually look like? Well, here's an image of several completed TMVs at WESTPAK. Not pictured here are the many hours that went into completing this project. Each of these binders is one TMV. I have a lot of respect for all you quality engineers and regulatory affairs experts out there, because I know just how much time and effort goes into these types of projects. These binders are considered complete packets that include work instructions, training logs, data recording forms, any raw data, as well as supporting documentations like calibration and maintenance records for equipment. All of this information is provided in a final summary report that can be a standalone document, but is also included in these binders for reference. I know this may all seem a bit excessive, but when it comes down to it, validated test methods are the basis for improving patient safety. By completing these method validations, the manufacturer, along with the regulatory bodies, can be confident in the safety and reliability of their packaging to protect their product and be able to be used safely in patients. If you would like some additional reading resources or are naturally curious about method validation, here are a few references. If you want detailed information into TMVs, I highly recommend the Medical Device Validation Handbook. It's a great resource with a lot of valuable information. And in case you're hearing about WESTPAK for the first time today, we are 100% employee-owned and an independent test lab. We have been in the testing industry for 35 years with experience in industries including medical device, pharmaceutical, electronics, and consumer goods. We specialize in a wide range of tests and have accreditations to ISO 17025 and ISTA. If you'd like further information or would like to get in touch, please reference this slide. My contact information is here as well.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
So we'd like to open it up to any questions. If you have any, please feel free to dump those in the Q&A section. We'll get to them. I found it interesting, Andrew, that you talked about how the validation falls on the responsibility of the testing laboratory. So that being said, if you are a medical device manufacturer and you have an internal lab, you still have to do that within your own lab. It's not a waiver, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So basically, the requirements for ISO 11607 require you to go through these test method validations, whether you're doing it in-house or whether you're testing at an external test lab. So it's just a requirement for ISO 11607 to conduct these TMVs.
Okay. So sometimes it may just be easier to outsource it to an independent testing.
Yeah, this is not an easy process. It is a lot of work, but it is definitely possible. You can definitely do it.
Okay. Let's see. We got a couple questions rolling through here. Is someone asked if I don't do all of the tests, do I still have to do the method validation? Like if I don't do concentrated impacts, do I have to do the test method validation for that?
So if you're not using a specific test for your validation, then you don't need to do it. Basically, you would need to provide a justification. It all really comes down to justifications as to why you chose certain test inputs and why you did not choose certain test inputs. So as long as your justification is sound, then you're good to go.
Okay, sounds good. A lot of questions rolling through on how to establish reproducibility and repeatability and the sensitivity within the testing. One specific to 1886, which is a visual inspection standard, and then just in general. Do we have the time to speak to that? It's a pretty loaded question.
We can definitely get into it and follow up, but basically it really depends on the individual test procedure. For example, as I mentioned, visual inspection, for example, is a qualitative test, so it's a little bit trickier to go into figuring out how to do your reproducibility and repeatability. So we can definitely follow up and get more technical, but for the purpose of this presentation, it's we'll dive into it later.
Yeah, I would say to anyone that's curious on that, the standard ASTM F3263, which is a standard guide for packaging test method validation. It's pretty robust and it has a lot of details on the types of R&R you can go into, make some recommendations for statistics, specifically in section 9, I believe this is. I was reading this morning. It's a pretty robust standard, so I'd recommend this one as a starting point. Again, that's ASTM F3263.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a question on how does it work when, like, we did the test method validation internal to WESTPAK for visual inspection for 1886, and we have the light set up and it's a very specific standard. How does a company then translate that back to their own inspection area in-house? If the lights may be different, if the setup may be a little bit different, is that taken into account?
I see. So basically we're following the ASTM standard or whatever standard for the test method validation. So it's not exactly one for one. By performing the TMV, it should be very, very close, but you would have to perform a TMV at different sites. It's different, if it'll be a different setup, might be different training procedures. So it's not exactly the same. You can leverage WESTPAK's TMV and use that as your justification, but if you're trying to replicate it exactly, you would have to do a full TMV at your site as well.
Okay. And I guess riffing off that a little bit, there's another question. If no test method is available, how do you develop a test method and validate it?
Ooh, that's a fun one as well. It's definitely possible, but again, you would need to do a lot of research as to like what your test method actually is, and you'd have to develop all that by yourself essentially. And then it really comes down to justification and to risk analysis as well.
It is all about risk. Yeah, I would again go back to that F3263 standard. It does do a step-by-step, here's the first step, here's the second step. WESTPAK has done test method validation specific for a customer that has their own protocol. So that's an option too, is you can just outsource it to an expert. And speaking of outsourcing and going back to that reproducibility and repeatability question, the statistics involved with TMVs are pretty complex and you want to make sure you get them right. So this is something that WESTPAK outsources to a subject matter expert statistician. So we do work with someone, we consult with them. They help us to determine the appropriate sample sizes and they do the statistical analysis on the back end of the TMV. So I would recommend taking that kind of approach because it gets a little bit elaborate. The picture that Andrew showed during the webinar was that rack of 4-inch binders. Each test input that we validated, the bubble, the dye, the peel, vibe, compression, all of those things, they each have their own 4-inch binder with substantial amount of appendices and statistics and documentation in there. So it does get to be a really, really intensive process and investment.
Yeah, definitely.
I actually don't know the answer to this question. Maybe you do, Andrew.
Yep.
When testing is performed for pharmaceutical products, do you follow the method validation requirement for medical device?
I'm not exactly sure where that requirement would come from, if it's either the FDA or ISO 11607, but it really would depend on where your specific requirement that you need to meet comes from. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that without knowing more about the actual requirement.
Yeah, I actually don't know that one either, but Hamid, we'll make sure that we follow up with you and see what we can get you that answer. Got a couple questions on, can I get a copy of this? I believe this webinar is available, and WESTPAK has a paper on test method validation that we'll be following up and sending to you guys as well. Wow, more questions rolling in, it's great. Do your two locations provide the same services or are there differences between them? That's an easy one.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'll let you answer that one.
Sure. So for the most part, they are the same. Both of our locations, one in San Jose and one in San Diego, are both about 40,000 square foot facilities with, vibe, shock, drop, all of the normal stuff. We have about 100 environmental and aging chambers between the two sites. So for the most part, they're the same. There's a few differences, which are a little bit more on the less frequently used scale. For example, our San Jose office has a product drop test machine, a tumble tester. San Diego is a little bit stronger on the ICH testing. So there's a few differences, but for the most part, they're pretty redundant labs. We found that the testing industry tends to be a little bit regional. Our customers like to come in and observe testing, or especially if there's failures, or to do some sort of a functional testing. So people like to be able to drive in. So that's a little bit on us. It's pretty fun though.
Yeah.
What I like about WESTPAK is that even though the equipment is the same, the stuff that goes on the equipment changes all the time. It's super cool. Like I said at the beginning, I walked into the lab last week and there was an electronic motorcycle on the vibe table. I was like, that's new. I've never seen that before. And yesterday I saw some those cryogenic freezers that are shipping pharmaceuticals that are maintained at minus 195 C. I was like, man, it's cool stuff that's going on. So. Let's see, for typical TMVs, around how many persons or operators do you typically use to establish reproducibility?
Ooh, that's a good question too. So this one will really come down to justification as well. We've seen anywhere from 1 to 3 operators and doing up to 3 trials. So a full TMV can include up to 3 engineers doing 3 separate trials to compare across the board to make sure that everything is repeatable and reproducible. So again, I'm always going to say this comes down to your justification. It really can go a long way if you provide the proper justification.
Yeah, I agree with that. And again, going back to that F3263 standard, there are some suggestions in there for minimum trials for gauge R&R studies. And like Andy said, it all comes down to the risk. If the risk of a label falling off of a medical device is actually low, because if a scrub nurse sees that and it's a medical device with that label, they're just going to throw it out. They're not going to take a guess. But the risk to a Tyvek pouch that may have a pinhole in it that someone can't identify and then throw out, that's a higher risk to patient safety. So it's going to require a higher level of gauge R&R, more operators, probably more sample sizes. It just all comes down to that risk.
Yeah. Nora, looks like we're kind of running low on time too. So if we didn't get to your question, we can definitely follow up, but I think we could probably take 1 or 2 more, right?
Sure. And maybe Lisa, if we don't get to all these questions, do we have everyone's contact info that we could follow up afterwards?
Yes, I will be able to give that to you.
Go.
If you guys are fine with time, if you want to take a handful more, it's fine on our end.
Okay. Let's see, one more question. Using F88 testing as an example, which is the peel test, train your staff to meet your established repeatability and reliability levels.
What was the exact question on that one? I'm not sure if I missed it.
I think if you train your staff to meet the levels, I think it's almost the other way around. We train the staff to do the testing and to the standards, and then we follow up to make sure that there's enough consistency across the board between operators to make sure that they're hitting the acceptance criteria. Yeah, which is again the point of validation.
You said it perfectly. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a softball for you. When do I need to revalidate?
Ooh, good question. So revalidation, I had a slide on that previously, but you would need to revalidate anytime something changes. So for example, if you update your equipment or if you replace a part that can affect the actual test, then you would need to revalidate. Same thing if you're developing a product and something changes, you're using a different material to seal your pouch, or you have a completely different configuration, you'd have to go through revalidation as well. Or like I said, if you provide a justification as to why you did not do revalidation, that would work as well, as long as that justification is solid and makes sense.
Great. There's a question of which standard do I keep referencing? So I went ahead and threw it in the chat there. Astm F3263. 3263, right? There's actually another standard that may be a little bit helpful. I'll dump that in as well. It's Astm D8282. It's a little bit more specific. The name of it is Standard Practice for Laboratory Test Method Validation and Method Development. So it sounds like it would be perfect. However, you start reading and it's pretty specific to the cannabis industry. However, that being said, the terminology, the definition section is really solid. And so I think there's a lot of information you can pull from there and relate back to a medical device test method validation. And again, that one, I'll dump that in the chat as well. Astm D8282. Here we go. All right, wow, so many questions coming in. It's really cool because there's so many people that we've worked with at WESTPAK for so long, and we're seeing you on here. And hey, Bill, it's great to have you guys come in.
I think I saw one about destructive testing. So if it is a destructive test, like for the sample size, you would literally have to discard those samples that you do testing on. So you're not able to reuse the sample for the different trials. So that is something you want to keep in mind when you're doing these trials and determining your sample size and determining your risk, is if you're able to provide that many samples to actually conduct the TMV, it's very important as well.
Right, which again goes back to that risk. And if you have a high risk, you need a high sample size, which means a high lot of materials, which means a higher cost to complete the validation. So that risk assessment is really the cornerstone of the entire process. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we touched on this too much, but I think it's probably important. Test method validation is a step in the process. You also have to do equipment validation, the IQ, PQ. You have to make sure that all of your equipment has proper preventative maintenance schedules. You have to do calibration. WESTPAK, we do calibration and we do semi-annual quality checks just to make sure that it's still on point. You need to ask your labs if they are NIST traceable. A higher step in that would be an accredited standard, ISTA 17025. You need to have a robust training program. So that's all foundational even before you get to the TMV process. So this stuff can become quite complex pretty quickly. And all of that would need to be documented within the test method validation reports. Mm-hmm. So we're getting a little bit over time here, so it's probably time to wrap up. Is there anything else you wanted to mention there, Andrew?
No, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and hopefully you guys learned something new about TMVs, and we're always here if you need to reach out for additional resources or references as well.
Agreed. We will try to follow up with all these individual questions that we didn't get to on an individual basis. WESTPAK historically has always been closed the Friday before Easter, so we're actually closed tomorrow, so please forgive a delayed response. However, we can be reached through westpak.com. That's WESTPAK.com. We have a customer portal in there. And we're just grateful that you all took the time to join us today. Thanks and have a great long weekend. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.